Good evening and welcome, everyone. My name is McClain Groff, and I'm a curatorial project assistant at the Whitney. I'm speaking to you from the lands of the Munsee Lenape and encourage everyone to take a moment to acknowledge the Indigenous lands from where you're tuning in tonight. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's edition of Ask a Curator. This program series provides an opportunity to hear from Whitney curators about their experiences organizing exhibitions at the museum, and then offers you the space to ask your own questions about the art, artists, and ideas behind the shows. Tonight's event is being recorded and will be posted to our YouTube channel if you'd like to rewatch or share. I'm thrilled to introduce tonight's speaker, Assistant Curator Jennie Goldstein, who will be giving us an inside look at In the Balance Between Painting and Sculpture, 1965 to 1985. This exhibition opened to the public last month here at the Whitney and will be on view through March 5th of next year. In the Balance brings together artworks from the Whitney's collection that cross boundaries and upset conventions. Regardless of whether they pour across or sit on the floor, the sculptures included here explore painting's domain through investigations of color, surface, and optical perception. The paintings, conversely, engage with sculptural concerns by taking up ideas long associated with three-dimensional art, such as balance and objecthood. By commingling elements of painting and sculpture, these artworks exist beyond established limits of what artists can do and upset the balance of pre-existing ideas of what art can be. I will return later alongside Jane Panetta, the Nancy and Fred Poses curator and director of the collection, to moderate the Q&A portion of the program. If you'd like to submit a question, please do so using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Click on the icon at the bottom of your screen and then type in and send your question. Please feel free to submit your questions during the talk, and we will select a handful of them to answer at the end. Thanks again for joining us, and I'll now hand it over to my colleague, Jennie Goldstein.
Hi, I'm Jennie Goldstein. I'm an assistant curator here at the Whitney Museum. This is In the Balance Between Painting and Sculpture, 1965 to 1985. This exhibition is drawn from the Whitney's permanent collection. It features approximately 12 works. As the title suggests, they are paintings and sculptures, and they're all made between 1965 and 1985. The general idea with this exhibition is to think about the way that artists who were active at this time were working in these mediums, were thinking deeply about what painting and sculpture had to offer to each other, what they want from each other. So it's a show that's full of reciprocity. Most of the works in the show are total abstractions or primarily abstract works. And so one of the ways that artists are thinking through the relationship between these mediums is they're thinking about how the structure of a painting, say like a shaped canvas, has presence in space that we might associate with sculpture, but it's still a painting. It's still defined as a painting, interacting with the wall as a painting. And we might also think about the way in which artists who are working in 3 dimensions, who are making sculptural objects, are just as invested in thinking about the role of color. What does color do to help us understand the space that they're occupying? All of these artists are invested in thinking about physical sight of these objects, the space that we occupy when we're with these objects. And that's part of what this show sets out to explore. So one of the really exciting things about this project is it's a chance to bring works into our galleries that are relatively new acquisitions or haven't been on view at the Whitney before. So when works come into the Whitney's collection, whether they're acquired through acquisition committees or are gifts that are donated to us, one of the things that my fellow curators and I do is we daydream. We think about how would we use these works? What shows might we make with them? What histories can they help us tell or tell better? What relationships might form between works that have long been in the collection or new to the collection or vice versa. So there were a couple of acquisitions that really started to spark this idea for me about thinking about these questions of reciprocity and thinking really generously, I hope, about this idea of balance. So one work in particular helped me start thinking in these terms, and that's a painting by Dorothea Rockburn called Balance from 1985. And in fact, the title of the show is taken from her work. So what's so interesting about this painting is you're actually looking at two shaped canvases, two polygons that are stacked slightly on top of each other. And so it can be a little bit confusing to even understand what you're looking at first. Is the shape on the surface the same shape as the substrate or the support? Or is the shape on the surface, the painted surface, doing something slightly different? And the answer is a kind of a mixture of the two, which is precisely what I mean about this idea of reciprocity. So the kind of red triangles that seem to emerge are there because of the paint, but they're also there because of the shape of the canvas itself. And that's true of the blue rectangle and the green square. And so one of the things that Rockburn is interested in thinking about is this idea of perception, what we can see. When she sort of translucently applies paint, you get the sense of that kind of thinness of it so that you can see the green through the red or the blue through the red. It's as if she wants to invite us to go all the way through from the surface of the paint through to the back, to the substrate, to the support, and to use that relationship to think about what perception even is. How do we even understand what we're looking at when we look at a painting? So there seems to be this question of mediums in the balance here, painting and sculpture, but also the relationship of these geometries. It's almost as if these two canvases are pulling apart from each other, like as if two overlapping triangles are kind of moving away from each other and finding this kind of momentary equilibrium. So this was one of the paintings that really helped spark this show for me. And I wanted to think about it more. What other ways could we think about balance? What other ways could we think about painting and sculpture during this time period? Another question for me, or kind of guiding light, was to think about how artists in this show, and we'll talk about them all, I guess, suppose briefly, are interested in questions that aren't necessarily tied strictly to the kind of known art histories that maybe help us make sense of this time period. This date range is a bit broad. It's a 20-year span, and a lot is happening in the world and in art at this time. Tremendous societal upheavals, um, all sorts of innovations in art making. And I don't really get into any of that here. This isn't a show about minimalism. It's not a show about process art. It's not a show about conceptualism. It's about all of these other kinds of ideas that artists were thinking about, especially at a time when so many new mediums were starting to become de rigueur or more promoted by tastemakers in the art world, critics and curators and the like. So conceptual photography or performance art, video, technological innovations, these were all very much on the minds of artists at this time period, including some of the artists in this show. But it's not as if artists lost interest in painting. It's not as if artists lost interest in making three-dimensional objects in space. All of these ideas are still very much alive and vital to these artists. So in a way, I wanted to kind of push aside the isms, as we might call them, something we might expect in a traditional march through American art history from mid 20th century to 21st century, and instead think about other ways in. And balance really offered a way in for me. So if the Rockburn is sort of on one side of this date range, the last work in the show made in 1985, then the Judy Chicago Trinity outdoor version is the earliest work, originally made in 1965 and then kind of reimagined or reconfigured later on in her career. So we have, on the one hand, a painting that is dealing with these questions of what the painted surface and the support kind of need or want from each other. And then on the other, we have a sculpture that's asking some of the same kinds of questions, triangular forms that change in size from small to large or large to small, depending on how you want to experience the work. and then are painted, spray painted. In fact, when she first made this work in 1965, she stretched canvas over plywood and sprayed it using a technique she learned in auto body school, which was very much a part of the minimalist drive at that time, when artists were interested in thinking about techniques and modes of making from outside of the quote unquote traditional art world. And the colors shift subtly along this color spectrum of a kind of deeper orange to a lighter orange. So again, this relationship of how we understand scale to be shifting and moving in space is happening both physically in three-dimensional space with the shape of the thing, the object, and also along the color spectrum. And they need each other. They require each other in order for this work to cohere. So those are the sort of touch points of this project. But the exhibition design is actually quite open, and purposefully so. It's really just one big room. And the idea here is not that there's one way to move through the space, or you start with a particular work and then move to another work. All of these works are visible to each other, in relationship to each other, from really anywhere you stand in the gallery space. So again, it sort of does away with the idea that we're marching from one point in history to another, and instead uses this kind of frame of these 20 years to think about the relationships that might emerge as these objects take and hold space together. So every show presents challenges, some more unusual than others. There's a whole set of questions that we have to ask ourselves when we make exhibitions, and every exhibition in every museum is a deeply collaborative project. The curator wants to consider a work, but they have to work closely with their colleagues in conservation to do any kind of treatment or assessment that that work might need in order to go on view. They similarly have to work closely with the registrars and exhibition designers to think about, how does this object occupy space, and how do we keep it safe, and how do we keep our visitors safe in the space. So it's this kind of interesting set of seeking balance. I mean, I think there's balance kind of in everything we do, in all over this show and in everything we do to make exhibitions. But there will always be challenges. And one of the most challenging works for us to display in this exhibition is Linda Benglis's Contraband from 1969, which is pigmented latex that she poured across the floor. It's a massive painting that lives on the floor. It has no support, doesn't hang on the wall, doesn't have stretchers or a frame or anything like that. It's a large object in space, but because it's latex that was poured out, started out wet and liquid and then hardened, it's low to the ground. So it creates all kinds of interesting questions just as an object. But it also creates certain kinds of challenges for the institution: how best to take care of it, how best to protect it, how best to protect you as a visitor as you're moving through the space. And so there are always those kinds of logistics to kind of work through. And that's one of the great puzzles of the work that we do in exhibition making. But the work itself is an interesting example of a work that's often described as part of this broader category of process art, as if the act of making it, as if the act of pouring massive drums of pigmented latex onto the ground in a variety of colors and kind of seeing how they swirl together is the thing, as opposed to the final result. But that's a kind of limited way of understanding this work, because in fact, what Benglis was interested in was not a rejection of illusion or of the referential world. In fact, this object, this thing, this pour or spill, as it's sometimes called, is full of all kinds of references. She's thinking about where she grew up in Louisiana. Contraband is actually the name of a bayou near her hometown. She's thinking about images of coming back from NASA space missions. She's not the only artist in this show who's fascinated with outer space and the kind of media culture surrounding that. She's thinking about the body, the kind of visceralness of our bodies. She's thinking about Vietnam and the visceralness of the loss of life and of war. All of this is essentially swirling around on the surface of this thing. But it's not just the surface, it is the thing, because It's not even paint, it's liquid latex that's been pigmented. So that swirling is both what you see and is literally what it is in front of your eyes. So this is a good example of a way that I like to think about some of the artists in this show, um, kind of weighing, like the idea of balance as a set of scales, or kind of weighing of options, or even just the idea of balance as a way of pondering something. What does it mean to work in abstraction, but also make works that are full of illusion, full of references, full of sparks that lead you to make connections to the world we live in and the world out there, the world in space. Um, and she's not alone. There are other artists in this show who I think are also deeply invested in questions of seeking an equilibrium, or weighing options, or pondering options. So Alma Thomas is a great example of someone who was also deeply infatuated with brand new images coming from outer space. This painting from 1972 is called Mars Dust. Um, and she was seeing images coming back from NASA space missions of dust storms on the planet Mars. These were brand new. Nobody had ever seen anything like this. Um, and she used what was really her kind of signature style of taking a band and using that to create these lengths of color. So you see a blue and a red kind of pushing and pulling against each other, this kind of relationship of positive space to negative space, that sense that the surface, even though we know it's flat, is actually kind of coming alive in front of our eyes. The red maybe signifying the dust, the blues maybe signifying what else is out there in outer space. And she's sort of pondering this, thinking about that kind of relationship. And another good example of artists who are kind of weighing something, thinking about balance in those terms, would be the Tishan Su. The image is a real optical illusion. It kind of tricks your eye. Su is broadly interested in questions of technology, um, and media saturation, and the relationship of media culture to our bodies, and a kind of mix of screen culture with kind of organic life. And so the surface of this painting is incredibly dimensional. It's as if it's a kind of topography with these indentations and extrusions, and at the very center, something that looks like a screen. It almost looked to our 21st century eyes, it almost looks like a tablet that's been propped up against the canvas. But of course, this is 1984 when he's making the Outer Banks of Memory. So he's not thinking in those terms at all, but he's almost anticipating the way in which media technologies would become this transportable, mutable thing. So again, kind of pondering that relationship between the inorganic and the organic, between media culture and ordinary life, between what we can see and what's kind of manufactured. So Al Loving's Rational Irrationalism from 1969 is such a perfect example of this question of kind of trying to find actual literal equilibrium, a kind of perfect balance. What you're looking at here is, again, shaped canvas, and then the illusion of these interlocking cubes that have the same shape as the shaped canvas themselves. So again, like with the Rockburn, what's happening on the surface with the paint and what's happening beneath the surface with the substrate are totally interdependent, totally reliant on each other. And it is perfectly geometrically symmetrical. So finding this moment of kind of suspended perfect balance. But what's kind of interesting too to think about for Loving is the limits of this, the way that even if you achieve a kind of balance, a formal balance, how potentially dissatisfying that can be. or how briefly satisfying it can be. So for this particular artist, by the early 1970s, after making many paintings that were working through these questions of geometries, he actually decided he didn't want to work in this mode at all and took examples of geometric paintings like rational irrationalism and cut them up, cut the canvas up into diamond shapes and other shapes, learned how to sew, and started making almost like quilted accumulations of fabric that weren't stretched and were presented in this totally different kind of way. So it's almost as if finding a perfect kind of balance, or finding some kind of balance between rational irrationalism, ultimately led to a kind of personal tipping point, and the artist's art changed dramatically. So Freddy Rodriguez, Y Me Quedé Sin Nombre, which is a brand new acquisition, on view for the first time. This too is a great example of this idea of kind of seeking equilibrium, trying to find balance and sustaining it, however briefly. You're looking at irregular polygons stacked one on top of another, striped in different configurations. And Rodriguez is an artist who came to geometric abstraction quite purposefully. He talks about how he was seeking a mode of making that could help quiet his mind, could help him find an internal, emotional, maybe mental balance, something that he wanted after a kind of tumultuous childhood in the Dominican Republic, where he was born and raised, and then came to the United States when he was 18. So just out of childhood, and looking for a way to express himself that could provide a counterpoint to kind of political upheaval he'd experienced in the Dominican Republic. He talks jokingly about how, you can't drink a pint and then make geometric abstraction, right? You need like a steady hand. You need a kind of calmness, a presentness. But he's often referencing, and in this particular title, he's joking or riffing on the way in which abstract paintings are often untitled. It translates roughly to, and I ran out of names. So the idea is it's a kind of untitled painting. But it also references dance forms like the merengue and other popular dance forms from the DR. And you can really see this idea of a body suspended in motion here, poised just so, kind of capturing that pause within something that's kind of full of energy and electricity and life. So Marianne Unger, this work, Waterspout from 1980-81, not actually in the Whitney's collection. This is on loan to us from her estate. The work that is in the Whitney's collection, from this same series called Red Vertebrae, it's actually out on loan to an exhibition, a Marianne Unger exhibition at the Williams College Museum of Art. Obviously, a huge part of what we do as a collecting institution is loan works from our collection to exhibitions elsewhere. So given the circumstances with our Marianne Unger work out on loan, I was able to collaborate with her estate to bring into this exhibition a work from the same series, which was really exciting because the works are quite similar but offer really interesting differences. But what they share in common is they're all shaped plywood, painted shaped plywood that has this curved feeling. So it looks and feels like a vertebrae, like a spine, like the body. And Unger was thinking about pregnancy, about the ways in which our bodies can shift and change in the process of growing new life, and then have that kind of temporary disequilibrium of having one's body be sort of repurposed in a certain kind of way, then brought back potentially after the birth of a child. And one of the things that I think is so interesting about this particular work, where you have the three curved parts of the water spout, is that they rely on the floor and the wall in order to become the artwork, in order to take their shape. They're in tension, they're balanced between the floor and the wall. So they too are poised. It's like this moment where everything is stilled and where this kind of equilibrium is found. But of course, we know that, any equilibrium we find is potentially temporary. And I think Unger was very interested in those kinds of questions. Another really interesting question for me to think about in this show is the role of our lives on, or the role of artists' lives on their artistic output. So, another kind of way of thinking about balance in this exhibition is the idea of making up for lost time, trying to balance one's life and one's art making, which sometimes can be totally intertwined, but sometimes have very different demands that they put on artists, and especially women artists. So, some of the women artists in this exhibition came to their careers later in life, in large part because of familial or professional obligations. And Andrade is one such example, Edna Andrade, who is a painter who spent her career in Philadelphia and had to work to support herself and worked as an art teacher or as a college professor, and became interested in optical art, art that has a kind of very visceral retinal impact, where the surface might appear to move or quiver or shift in front of your eyes because of the relationship of line to color. She was interested in some of these questions. She was interested in perception, just like Rockburn and like so many others. But she also, like Rodriguez, was looking for a way of making that could make sense of the world outside of her artistic impulses. In other words, because she was so busy as a teacher, as an instructor, she felt she had to come up with a mode of making that she could pick up and put down as her schedule allowed. So to her, working in this kind of optical mode was in some ways akin to working in, let's say, like embroidery, where you have a very specific plan and you can do some of it one day, put it down, pick it up again. She talked about how you wouldn't have to get into some kind of state of transcendent grace or something like that, as she imagined more expressive painters might have to do, because she had a path and a plan and a kind of logic that she was following, excuse me. So that's what I mean about kind of balancing out, or balancing out these different kinds of demands that are placed on an artist, both professionally and personally. And Kay Walking Stick is an artist who's similarly thinking about these questions of her personal life and her work life. In 1973, she went to graduate school at Pratt Art Institute in Brooklyn to pursue an MFA in painting. She was already in her late 30s at the time. She had children. She was living in suburban New Jersey and commuting to Brooklyn in order to kind of finally be able to make art outside of her house. She'd never been able to do that before, and to really study and kind of invest in her art making. And she started this series of apron paintings because she was thinking about this kind of form and its sort of dual role, like the apron that you wear in the studio, in a painter's studio, to protect your clothes or wipe your brushes on or wipe your hands on, is the same kind of garment that you might wear in the kitchen to do kind of the exact same thing, protect your clothes, wipe your hands on. They're both part of a process of making, but they're part of a process of making with very different artistic and political outcomes. So this was very much on her mind. What I love about this particular painting, which is the most representational in the show, is it's still so tethered to abstraction, because you'll note that the apron is disembodied here, right? There's no painter present. The apron is hanging up on a kind of wall or a space or a painting. It's not totally clear, pinned by the points of the strings and the part that loops around your neck. And then what's behind that is an abstract composition. So you're kind of pulled from this thing that helps make the painting into the painting itself. But of course, they're one and the same. Another way that I like to think about balance is the question of what you make or what you take and what remains after. So think about, say, your bank account. When you take money out of your bank, what's left, the balance, is just as important in a way as what you've just extracted. So they are very much in a kind of conversation. And I think that this is a useful way of thinking about artists who worked in or work with shaped canvases, who are deeply invested in the relationship of the object, the painting, to physical space or to the wall. So Novros's No Title from 1969 is a good example of this. It's molded fiberglass and resin with automotive paint on the surface in multiple parts. So they kind of slot together or join together on the wall. And Novros is actually someone who is deeply invested in fresco, a mode of making where the paint and the wall are one and the same. So for him, the idea that you would stand in front of a painting and it would be a kind of illusionistic window onto the world is like the exact opposite of what he's after. He wants you to feel the relationship of the painting to the space that you're in. That blank space, the empty space of the wall, that remainder is totally essential here. You can't have an understanding, or physical or optical or any kind of understanding of this work, without those parts being in a kind of conversation with each other or in deep relationship with each other. And the same is true of Jane Kaufman's untitled work, also from 1969, two shaped canvases with subtly shifting, very pastel, beautiful, ethereal colors. These two long strips of canvas actually kind of undulate on the wall. So they end up feeling very atmospheric. The wall is clearly visible because there's space in between the two parts and all around it. And it's almost as if you're getting some glimpse of the sky or glimpse of space around you. It's a kind of magical work. So here too, this question of what she makes, the painted thing, is important. That's the thing we take in a way. But then what remains, that remainder, the wall, behind it, around it, all around us, is essential to our understanding, as was the case with Novros. So just yet another way of thinking about balance, this idea of kind of assessing the remainder, taking that seriously, or just as seriously as we might take the part that we might define as the artwork. So all of these valences of balance, or kind of sub-definitions of balance, are really in conversation with each other, but they give us other ways other ways of considering these objects outside of maybe the expected ways of considering these objects. And I hope, after spending time in the galleries, be able to feel some of these connections across these categories, or come up with entirely different ones, because there's lots of different ways to think about balance.
I am back now with Jane to do the Q&A portion of
Excellent.
this program. We've got some great questions. Let's see. Okay, the first question. Do you think artists working presently are as concerned with the split between the mediums? Was there something specific that these artists were responding to? It feels like interdisciplinary work is much more common now.
Interesting. That's a good question. I think the first thing I'd say to that question is the group of artists in this show, you know, even the sampling that Jennie so thoughtfully put together, I think it's hard to generalize about them. So some of them I think, really identified as painters. Someone like Alma Thomas, for example, and others, David Novros, who was making work that had a kind of dimensional quality to it, even talked about himself very explicitly as a painter. But then there are actually a number of other artists in the show, even as early as the 60s or shortly thereafter, that they themselves were already working in an interdisciplinary manner or would go on to do that. I'm thinking of someone like Linda Benglis, who was working across many mediums. Certainly Judy Chicago, who was invested in sculpture in particular early on, but then goes on to make paintings and lots of works on paper, makes performance work, is another person really thinking very expansively about how kind of ideas can be kept consistent, but across a variety of mediums. So I think that's a great question, because the show kind of gets at that just by design in terms of who was selected for the show. They're very different approaches. Tishon, someone who made painting and sculpture, often showing them together and explicitly having them in dialogue. So I think this is an issue, but there's not kind of one singular approach within the selection of artists in the show. And I think for a lot of them, even as early as the 60s and 70s, they were thinking in a cross-disciplinary way, even though maybe more and more artists are working in that fashion.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Jane.
Of course.
Okay, another question. Does latex present any particular conservation issues? So this question is in reference to the Linda Benglis work Contraband, which you saw on the floor that Jennie spoke about, from 1969.
That's another really good question. And I think you and I were sort of involved with some of these questions in working on the show. What does it mean to show work that's 50 plus years old, made out of a material like latex? It does, over time, present very real conservation concerns. The work can begin to deteriorate, the color can fade and change. And we worked very closely actually with our conservator here to try to improve the color of the work in advance of the show. And her name is Margot Delado, and she was really able to kind of improve the look of the work. It's not the kind of day glow colors that it would have been when Benglis first made it, but I think the current state of it gets more closely at that. But, McClain, you and I talked about this. There's also the question of what does it mean to show a work over time that really is quite changed from the original conception of it, and how do we get comfortable with that possibility? How do we involve both a conservator in that discussion, but also an artist? So I think it is challenging kind of physically, formally, but it's also conceptually and kind of almost ethically challenging over time. And the more a work like this ages, it will get more and more challenging, presumably.
Absolutely. Yeah, an ongoing conversation between the artist or estate and the owner. Which
Definitely.
Is us. Next question.
Sure.
Okay, let's see. Okay. How do we work with living artists for a project like this?
Another good question. And, I think something that Jennie Goldstein, the curator of the show, thought about really carefully, and something we think about kind of holistically with all of the collection shows we do. So with a show like this, Jennie began working on it, kind of came to a thesis or kind of organizing idea for the show, then worked on the checklist, and then slowly began to reach out to each of the artists and talk to them about the ideas for the show, like some of the other artists that might be in the show, when the show would be happening. And I think it always feels important to us here at the Whitney to have a dialogue with artists, living artists in particular, obviously, about works we're presenting here and the context we're putting the work in, and are really open to hearing if it's something that feels kind of exciting and generative to them, or if they have feedback. And then on a more kind of practical level, we can often get additional information about a work at the moment we put it on view. It's a kind of great and natural way to do collection research, I would say. We can learn more about the kind of genesis of the making of the work, like of the title of a work, how a work should or should not be installed. So it really becomes a wonderful chance to kind of get more information potentially than we've had, especially for something that's either a new acquisition or that we haven't shown in a really long time. And we got, since the show's gone up, we've heard from artists about about a number of things. So it becomes a kind of generative dialogue, I would say.
Absolutely. One more question? Maybe?
Sure.
Okay. So Jennie mentioned that there was an earlier version of the Judy Chicago work, Trinity. Was there a reason the artist produced this second version, Trinity, in parentheses, outdoor version?
That's another good question. And yet, right, Jennie talks about that a little bit. This is a work that was fabricated in 2019 as a kind of more recent edition of the work. And as you said, it can go outside because it's polyurethane paint on stainless steel. So it's a work that can kind of endure the elements, so to speak. The original version was canvas wrapped around wood, right? So that would not have been something that could be outside. So I think for Judy Chicago, and Jennie talked to her about this a little bit, I think it didn't even occur to her at the time that it was like kind of possible for her to fabricate a work like this in a different material with different conditions, so it could go outside, that she, in the course of a career, could make one version but then think about reimagining it or refabricating it, so it could live in a different context. So she made this very early on in her career, and I think resources, even the ability to just imagine that, and where would I do that, how would I do that, that wasn't available to her, but became available over time. And I also think it's interesting and like really meaningful to think about her interest in remaking it so much later. It's not just because she could, presumably, it's also because she saw it as a really important and valuable work, I would say, in her overall oeuvre. So that she would want to go back to it in slightly modified materials to be able to present it in a different context. To me, that signals this was a really important work to her, and that I think made us excited about acquiring it and about acquiring a later edition of it too.
Yeah, which is particularly interesting because this work is from earlier on in her career, right?
Yeah, totally.
Before she sort of moved away from this more minimalist approach. Yeah.
So it could have been something that she saw as a kind of in a very definitive past part of her career. But instead, I feel like by remaking it signals it was a really important part of a continuum.
Yeah. I think that will wrap up here. Thank you all for tuning in tonight. Thank you, Jane.
Thank you.
Thank you for the great questions. Thank you, Jennie, for shedding light on these artists and your process of putting this show together. We hope you'll all have a chance to see the exhibition In the Balance Between Painting and Sculpture, 1965 to 1985, which is on view until March 5th of next year. Thank you.